In this video, I'm going to be going over presentational aids. Now, keep in mind when we're talking presentational aids for our persuasive speeches, you may not use them. I'm not going to require them for an online speech, but if you want to use them, definitely keep to these rules and sort of guidelines that we've got. But in general, these are good things to keep in mind moving forward should you use presentational aids in any speeches moving forward. So a presentational aid is anything that helps your speech in a visual kind of way. We're thinking about things like handouts, PowerPoints, posters, images, videos, those sorts of things. Whenever we're going to use a presentational aid within a speech, we really want to make sure that we are using something that is necessary. We're not just putting something visual in for the sake of putting something visual in. So you want to have pieces of evidence that really make sense, that enhance what you're saying, that give us context, that add to what you are already saying. All of these things mean that we are seeing something that helps us as an audience, not something that is just there. Another good thing about presentational aids too is that they can help reduce speaking anxiety, because there's this perception that the audience is paying more attention to the thing that's presented than to the actual speaker themselves. And so it's a really nice relaxation moment because it's not as focused in on you. Some good guidelines to keep in mind is that a good presentational aid is big enough to be seen easily, which means you need to know where your audience is, how your audience is viewing things, so that it is easily seen. It also needs to be clear and easy to understand. Not too much information, very succinct, to the point. It is what it is. We understand why you're showing it to us. It should also be neat and professional. Remember, when you're giving speeches with presentational aids, you're usually doing them in front of people like your future bosses, right? Or in terms of large groups where you want to make a good impression. So you should have neat and professional presentational aids. We want to make sure that it enhances the verbal message, that it makes sense, and that it's not just a random picture for the sake of being in there. And then lastly, we want to make sure that your presentational aid is not dangerous, unpredictable, illegal, things like that. Mostly because your audience is going to be so focused and fixated on that presentational aid as opposed to focused on you. And you also don't want anybody to feel unsafe. Yes, you might be doing a speech on gun safety, but bringing a gun into the classroom may not necessarily be the best use of presentational aid. Perhaps an image would be better in that case, because there are going to be members of your audience that feel nervous, uncomfortable, scared, being around an actual gun, for instance. Now, of course, with that idea of what makes a good presentational aid, let's talk about some of the pitfalls of presentational aids. So sometimes we can tend to use it as a crutch to try to make our speech better or longer, feeling like, oh, it'll be okay, we're just padding it out. Don't use a presentational aid for that reason, right? Sometimes we may also put in too many different fonts, too many different words, all of those sorts of things, trying to make it look flashier. Different fonts, different styles, too much on any given slide is just going to clutter up your message. Same goes with having too many words on any given slide or any individual piece. You want to make sure that the words you're using are precise and concise, that they're there for a reason, they're saying what you mean, and that it's not too many words. You also want to make sure that your images make sense and that they connect to the speech and that they're enhancing that. And it's not just, again, a picture for the sake of a picture. Other things we want to consider is that the visual aid that you're using, you want to be using at the moment you are talking about it. Oftentimes we'll want to throw in a blank slide in a PowerPoint, for instance, just before our image and just after our image, so that we are only seeing the image when we're referencing it, and then it's blank on the screen up until that point, and then directly after the point that we're talking about it. That way, our audience doesn't continue to fixate on whatever picture is up there. You also want to make sure that you don't have too much written up there, because sometimes your audience will spend more time reading than actually listening to you. And then another pitfall is that not everybody logs out of all of their messaging services or notifications. And trust me when I say you do not want that embarrassing text posted up on the screen for everybody in the room to be able to see. I've heard horror stories about these kinds of things happening. So make sure that you're logging out of your messaging services, that you're turning off those notifications so that they're not distracting, and also you're not revealing personal information. Some more pitfalls include not talking to the screen. Now, this is, of course, going to apply when you are in person in a speech and not necessarily online with a speech, but it's very easy to turn your back to the audience. And as much as the audience would love to get a view of your backside, you don't want to show it to them too much. You want to maintain eye contact, so don't talk to the screen. You also want to make sure that you're not handing out something during your speech. This is going to distract your audience. They're going to pay more attention to the handout and trying to pass the handout out than they are to you and your speech in general. You also want to make sure that with visual aids, you're thinking about the fullness of the way that you've designed your PowerPoint slides in particular, and that you are using the available space and not leaving large chunks of empty space. So really think about the design of your slides in particular. Also, another pitfall, making something visible before you're talking about it. So let's say you're doing a speech on puppy mills, and you want to show this very dramatic image of a sad puppy in a cage, obviously one who has been abused, etc., right? If you bring that up too soon, your audience is going to be so fixated on that image that they're going to lose sight of what you are and what you are saying. So use your images specifically and precisely. Also, watch out for a heavily designed theme that distracts from what you're trying to say. The theme I'm using, for instance, in this particular video is a great, simple, nondescript one. There are definitely designs out there for your PowerPoints that can get very, very busy. You don't want to have too many images. And like I said, you don't want to have images that are so distracting that the audience pays more attention to them than they do you. When speaking with a presentational aid, there's a couple of things you want to keep in mind. First, especially if you're using a video or audio clip, you want to try to keep it shorter. Thinking somewhere around 30 seconds or less for a short speech. So we're definitely want to keep it 30 seconds or less. And we only want to use video or audio clips if it makes sense to use them and not just say it ourselves. You also want to download the videos if possible, without switching screens if you can. One of the reasons for downloading the videos as well is that you want to make sure that you've got it downloaded so that you're not relying on the internet to try to make those connections for you. Now, I probably shouldn't be recommending a YouTube downloader, but there are downloaders that exist out there so that you can pull clips out of things. You want to make sure that you're attributing your source. You want to make sure that you're giving correct attribution to those kinds of things. And technically, really, you shouldn't be pulling those videos off the internet anyway, but it's kind of a common assumption that that is something that happens. So download if possible so that you don't have to rely on your connectivity. Something else, make sure that you're practicing with them in the space if you're able. And for us in class, make sure that you do a couple of run-throughs, practicing what that's going to look like on your screen using the visual aids before you use them for your actual recording. And then lastly, you definitely want to troubleshoot and make sure that you have alternate plans, because there's nothing worse than really wanting to show a video, not having that video, and not having a backup plan and panicking. So work out contingency plans just in case something doesn't work. For the rest of this video, we're going to be going over some examples of both good and bad presentational aids, how we can think about them, and how we can make the most effective visual aids that we possibly can. So let's start by taking a look at this visual aid. Take a moment and really think about what works and what doesn't work. This particular speech is on models being too thin for the industry. So some things you may notice. You can kind of see that these models are thin. They are definitely on the skinny side, so it is definitely adding to the topic. However, I'm busy trying to figure out what the article says when I look at this. There's too many models for me to keep my eye focused on any one. The words are really small, so I'm struggling trying to read them, and I'm way more interested in that. I've got a couple of different colors, which is nice, but I'm really interested in drawn to Fashion Bulletin, and Bulletin in particular because it's blue, and Look Now because it's red, and Perfect Accessory because it's in that orange. My eye is bouncing all around, which is good for the layout for a magazine, but is bad for the layout for a visual aid. Now let's take a look at this image. We see the model in this picture. It's the same topic, but it's a much better example. It's a single image, so I'm focused. It clearly shows the body of the model, which is different than what we saw in the previous images. So I can see bone sticking through skin, for instance, that gives me a different impression of thinness compared to my previous picture. And it's very clear and succinct. I didn't need all those extra words. I didn't need all those other models. I really just need one to be able to understand it. Now let's take a look at this picture. Our topic is study abroad. Take a moment and think about what works and what doesn't work about it. You may think, okay, this has got a very clear headline. It does, learn new cultures. That is potentially a point within the topic of study abroad. That's fantastic. Now let's look at the picture. Is the picture really saying anything? Not really. It's not giving me any additional information. Why flags? Why not show pictures of people actually learning aspects of new cultures, right? Instead, what I see is this picture that doesn't really fill up a lot of the space, that is pixelated, isn't very high quality, that is just a stock picture of something. It doesn't tell me any new information, and so I, as an audience, am left wondering, why am I looking at this? So this image isn't bad. We have 4 different images of the way that tiers are made up. But then there's this chunk of information down at the bottom that, again, I'm drawn to and I want to read instead of listening to the speaker. So instead, I might break up the 4 images versus the chunk. You see how much better that looks without that chunk of information down at the bottom? Now I can talk about each one individually. Additionally, what I might do is I might animate this slide to bring up each one as I introduce it, so that my slide is dynamic, it's more interesting, and I'm bringing up the image as I'm talking about it, not just having all these images up the entire time. In this slide, I have an image of a video, and there's the problem. My video is not working. So again, Think about what contingency plans you have in case the video is not working. There's also something else that's a little weird about this slide. See if you can figure out what it is. Here's a hint. It's with the layout. If you said that it's weird that I can see parts of the slide design behind it, such as that section header, you'd be absolutely right. But I guess a bigger question is, why isn't the video itself the size of the slide? So really think about that formatting. Here's another good example of something that works really well as an infographic, but doesn't work really well for actual speeches. And a lot of that's because there's just so much information on here. It's great, it's very clear information, and as I said, as an infographic, it works. But as a presentational aid, not so much. When using graphs, you want to make sure that you are drawing to my attention where I should be looking. Now, there's information on here, there's clear information, but it's also very succinct. I can read it, I can see it, I know what I'm looking at. It's not too much that it overwhelms me, and then that red circle really helps me key in where I'm supposed to be looking. Let's take a look at this slide. If you said there's way too much information on here for me to really be able to see, you would be right. Less information, cut it down a little bit. Yes, seeing that nice curve and the way that the chart is laid out is really helpful, but it's too much for an audience to be able to see. Additionally, again, the layout is a little weird. Take out that header so that we're not seeing that floating in the background. And then our last example. There's nothing wrong with going low tech, but when we have to go low tech, we have to make sure that it looks appropriate, that it doesn't look juvenile, that it looks the way that it's meant to. A lot of times what we do when we have to bring in posters for things such as poster sessions at conferences, or when we're presenting things in a conference room among our colleagues or things like that, is we'll create it on a computer and print it out in a large format. The handwriting here, the way that it's done, the fact that there's glitter on here, it all feels very not college level / professional level. So you want to make sure that whatever you do meets a certain level of professionalism. And that's all we have for our presentational aids. Thanks for listening, y'all.